In the last episode of The Time Compass, but Clotilda talked about it, and talked about it, and talked about it, and so it was decided Clovis would be baptized a Christian. This was an important event because from Clovis on, all the Franks converted to Christianity. And this formed a very important relationship between kings and the Christian church that would last for centuries. The Time Compass. The Carolingian Empire, Part 2. Pepin was a Frankish duke whose land was in Soissons, some 100 kilometers from Paris. They called him the Short because, well, let's just say because he wasn't very tall. This Pepin, the Short, was not very happy with the small parcel of land that he had. Despite his limited height, Pepin felt big enough to become the king of the Franks. He had a plan. Pepin noticed that the Pope in Rome, who was the head of the church, had a lot of influence over all the Christians in the kingdom. So, Pepin sent armies to Italy to defend it from invaders and aggressors, allowing him to create the Papal States, making the church kind of like its own kingdom. In thanks, Pope Zachary gave him all his support, and in the year 754, Pepin was crowned the new king of all the Franks. Pepin the Short had achieved great things. But despite his large status in history, his son was destined to be even larger. And he was tall, too. This soon-to-be famous son of Pepin was named Charlemagne. And he built on his father's success by sending more armies to Rome and expanding the territories of the Pope even more. For this, the Pope named him
Romanorum Ecclesia Protector,
which means something like Protector of the Church of Rome. With this title, Charlemagne conquered lands to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. His aim was to control the whole European continent, converting all the inhabitants to Christianity. After tireless campaigns against the Lombards, Saxons, Avars, Slavs, the Goths, and the Visigoths, Charlemagne managed to create his great empire. But he was not only a great conqueror. Charlemagne also wanted to unite the lords and villagers in his empire under one single religion and one shared culture, basing his power on knowledge.
The first universities.
Around the year 800, Charlemagne was finally king of all the lands of Europe. And he was popular, far and wide. The huge realm that Charlemagne created was called the Carolingian Empire. Despite being a very powerful ruler, Charlemagne had not gone to school. He had spent his childhood learning to fight and conquer territories. In fact, at that time, that was all any of the nobles did. The complex ideas behind math or philosophy or science were considered a huge waste of time. But Charlemagne wanted to know more about the world. He had a thirst for knowledge. Something that wasn't very common in those times. His brilliant idea was to gather wise men and poets from throughout the world to his court, inviting them to discuss questions ranging from the importance of God to the origins of the world and the stars. He even learned Latin, the language of the ancient Romans, and made sure that it was taught in many churches and monasteries in his empire. However, it was very difficult for Charlemagne to write, maybe because his hand had gone numb from holding a heavy iron sword for so much of his life. So, the job was left to monks to document all the universal knowledge that was being taught in the churches. This was the origin of universities, as we know them today. 2 centuries after Charlemagne, many universities emerged from these monasteries. For example, the University of Bologna, which was founded in the year 1088 and is the oldest university in Europe. Or Oxford University, where teaching began as early as 1096.
Gothic cathedrals.
The alliance between Charlemagne and the Pope was a very serious thing. The king ordered the building of many churches and monasteries throughout his empire. In the beginning, Romanesque churches were built with large, dark, vaulted ceilings. The atmosphere was muted, which helped accentuate the religious experience. But these churches were also built this way because the architects of that age had not yet mastered sophisticated building techniques, and their main goal was to make sure structures didn't collapse. A few centuries later, around the year 1100, a new style began to develop for the cathedrals of Europe. Much larger buildings were built. Their giant windows, decorated with stained glass, cleverly put together to display complex and beautiful pictures, gave these new churches a feeling of grandeur. These huge buildings are called Gothic cathedrals. These giant buildings were made possible by using arched ribs that displaced weight to the columns on the side. This allowed for enormous, luminous vaults to be held up by very thin columns, creating great heights, which gave the visitors a feeling of awe and wonder. The change from Romanesque to Gothic shows how the people of the time were starting to think differently. While the Romanesque was rooted to the ground, the Gothic soared towards the heaven, with its tall towers rising up to be closer to God.
The coronation of Charlemagne.
On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne could be found praying in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III approached him and, while all his people kneeled before him, crowned him Emperor of the Romans. The great kingdom of Charlemagne was transformed into an empire. Charlemagne wanted to revive the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire. One of the funny things about this is that Charlemagne and his people were not Romans, nor Italians, but Germans. The same people that had long ago attacked and destroyed Rome. But the wheel of history had spun, and now it was a Germanic people that ruled much of Europe and who wanted to unify all the peoples under one empire. Leaders throughout the world paid their respects to Charlemagne. For example, the great Eastern Muslim prince Harun al-Rashid didn't just send a gift of precious treasures, but also showed his respect by sending Charlemagne an elephant.
An elephant! Talk about an awesome gift!
This famed empire was made possible by the intelligence, willpower, and leadership of one great man, Charlemagne. But unfortunately, all these achievements were being held together by this one man. Once he died, his great empire soon disappeared. 14 years after his coronation, in the year 814, his empire was divided up between his 3 grandchildren and soon split up into the kingdoms of Germany, France, and Italy. The schools created by Charlemagne fell into decay, and the art of reading and writing remained isolated in some scattered monasteries. The Carolingian Empire, the great work of Charlemagne, did not last too much longer. And in the following centuries, Europe fell back into constant wars and invasions that made any efforts of unity and shared growth impossible. Charlemagne dreamed of a united Europe with shared goals and aspirations, and this continues to be one of the desires of the countries that make up Europe today, 1,200 years later. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass to discover the history of universities. Schools and universities, centers of knowledge, have made appearances in nearly all great civilizations. Some, such as the schools of China, could be as old as 2,500 years. And in 331 BC, Alexander the Great created the Great Library of Alexandria. But when these civilizations fell, so did their centers of learning. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the year 476, and again after Charlemagne's rule in the 800s, knowledge became the privilege of a few monks and priests who protected their precious books within the thick walls of monasteries. Then, in the year 1088, the University of Bologna was founded. From that time on, universities began to blossom all over Europe. Teaching began at Oxford in 1096. The University of Paris was founded in 1150, and so on. Centers of knowledge have lasted through the centuries, and you can find modern students studying there to this very day.